Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I'm back. I want to share a few thoughts on Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is a book that one of my friends describes as his epitaph for the jazz age, and it certainly is that. But it's much more than that. It's almost an epitaph for Fitzgerald's marriage. For a way of life that he personally possessed. There's something about the book into which he was pouring his heart and soul, the hearts and souls of those around him, his wife Zelda, their friends. And what emerges is this book that is striving to be a masterpiece. But what it really seems to be is a cliff that we're slowly watching fall into the sea as it's eroded. There's not a volcanic explosion to send this cliff into the sea. It's just the erosion of time, the elements, the aspects of reality that just seem to get to all of us. That's what Fitzgerald is expressing here. And throughout all of that, he's striving for these heights. We have immaculate senses, beautiful allusions and illusions that Fitzgerald is crafting. And there's a way in which he's expressing these ideas in his most consummate style, that he is really working and reworking and iterating ideas that he has swimming around in his mind. The disintegration of Dick Diver, which the novel explores, is Fitzgerald's reflection of his own disintegration in many ways. The disintegration of his marriage, but the disintegration of his perhaps abilities as an artist, abilities as a writer, as someone who was the voice of his generation, that he is finding that his voice is being silenced. And how does he deal with that? How does he reconcile himself to these realities, to this diminishing of his power? And so we have this towering monument to his failures, in a sense, his personal and artistic failures. Is the book itself a failure? Well, when I read it at 22 for the first time, I certainly thought it was. I thought, this is his last major work. This is the last novel Fitzgerald finished. This Side of Paradise was okay. It was pretty solid. The Beautiful and the Damned was quite darn awful. The Great Gatsby was a masterpiece, and so, okay, Love of the Last Tycoon was unfinished. There were some gems of stories, but what was Tender is the Night? And I finally got my hands on it, and I didn't like it. I thought that there was something that was just too drowned in the pathos about the writing Fitzgerald had here. And so I wanted to reapproach it now that I'm near the age he was when he wrote the book, to see, okay, does that sense of age and experience and my own failures, does that give me a different perspective on how I appreciate and approach this novel? So I want to get into that, but I do want to give a sense of some of the best writing Fitzgerald was capable of. And he kicks off, the first page is just incredible. On the pleasant shore of the French Riviera, about halfway between Marseille and the Italian border, stands a large, proud, rose-colored hotel. Deferential palms cool its flushed facade, and before it stretches a short, dazzling beach. Lately, it has become a summer resort of notable and fashionable people. A decade ago, it was almost deserted after its English clientele went north in April. Now, many bungalows cluster near it, but when this story begins, only the cupolas of a dozen old villas, rotted like water lilies among the massed pines between Gasse's Hotel d'Etrangers and Cannes, 5 miles away. The hotel and its bright tan prayer rug of a beach were one. In the early morning, the distant image of Cannes, the pink and cream of old fortifications, the purple Alp that bounded Italy, were cast across the water and lay quavering in the ripples and rings sent up by sea plants through the clear shallows. Before 8, a man came down to the beach in a blue bathrobe, and with much preliminary application to his person of the chilly water and much grunting and loud breathing, floundered a minute in the sea. When he had gone, beach and bay were quiet for an hour. And this continues. This setting is drawn so well, so beautifully. The tiny details, the word choice there. There's this labor of love, this intensity to the way Fitzgerald is recalling these ideas from memory. Writing this book took years for him to write, and so that labor and effort is very evident on a number of the passages. There are moments in Tender is the Night where Fitzgerald really has found the perfect setting of each word. It's this massive, beautiful bracelet or ring in which every tiny detail is filigreed immaculately. But what struggles, I think, at the heart of the novel is that he can't sustain that. And that perhaps is, again, a reflection that mirrors the theme of the book, of the disintegration of Dick Diver, the promising young psychiatrist who has engaged in a relationship that certainly from the 21st century we look askance at. And that even then perhaps was controversial, that a man would become betrothed and fall in love with one of his patients. There are certainly aspects of power there that we continue to grapple with as we read the book. And that I think Fitzgerald was really intensely trying to explore, but he was reversing these because he was viewing it from the lens of his own upwardly mobile aspirations and the fact that he did not have as much money as he would have liked, as his friends had. And so Dick Diver, as the poorest character in a sense among the set, that is something that Fitzgerald really felt, and he keeps belaboring this idea that Diver doesn't have as much money, doesn't possess as much. In another passage, he writes, "But the diffused magic of the hot, sweet South had withdrawn into them. The soft pod night and the ghostly wash of the Mediterranean far below, the magic left these things and melted into the two divers and became part of them." Rosemary watched Nicole pressing upon her mother a yellow evening bag she had admired, saying, "I think things ought to belong to the people that like them," and then sweeping into it all the yellow articles she could find, a pencil, a lipstick, a little yellow notebook, because they all go together. And there are these ways in which he's exploring these moments that he introduces us to these characters at their height. And he's a man who has realized very much that he has been at his height. That this is a book in which he's trying to get back to that height. But he's finding that the mountain he once climbed is no longer as tall as it once was. And even if he gets to the top, there's this sense that Fitzgerald is never going to create a book as strong as The Great Gatsby. He knows this as he's writing it. And that sense of pathos just drowns so many of the moments where he's trying to create a very emotional sense for his characters. Because I think one of the flaws of the book, and it was something that I couldn't quite articulate the first time I read it, but what I was sensing now is that Fitzgerald is really interested in writing two aspects of Diver's life. He's interested in writing him at his height, when he has this sense of joie de vivre, when he has this sense of power, this magnetic charisma that just works. And he's also interested in writing Diver at his very worst, at his lowest, at his most angry, alcoholic, vicious, racist, unpleasant, vile aspect. He's interested in those two. What he struggles to sustain is I think his own interest in Diver's disintegration, perhaps because it was too painful for him to write and to examine the aspects of his life when he had moments where he wasn't angrily drunk and fighting with people and just off, being his most brutal self. It was rather these moments where it's about to happen. It's a moment when he perhaps could have turned things around or felt that he and Zelda could have somehow managed something different. And those are the aspects that are so crucial to the book, this entire section of the book where we see Diver falling from his height and slowly trying to seduce the young actress who she expressed an interest in him earlier, some years ago, realizing that he thinks he's cured his wife, Nicole, of the different mental illnesses she had. And yet he's as Fitzgerald's writing these aspects of Diver, there's something that's not quite there. There's a passion that has fallen away, and perhaps he can't bring himself to face those moments. He writes in another passage. Here we go. The delight in Nicole's face to be a feather again instead of a plummet, to float and not to drag. She was a carnival to watch, at times primly coy, posing, grimacing, and gesturing. Sometimes the shadow fell and the dignity of old suffering flowed down into her fingertips. Dick wished himself away from here, fearing that he was a reminder of a world well left behind. He resolved to go to another hotel. And that's one of the last passages where Fitzgerald really seems to capture this moment, these tiny little details where he can examine and express the reality at the best, most intense, perfect detail he can. Because he then goes for another 70 or so pages before he gets to this moment where he writes his own epitaph. And he has a character say to Dick Diver, who has aspects of Fitzgerald, if not being an absolute, autobiographical character. This character says to him, "That's something you do so well, Dick. You can keep a party moving by just a little sentence or a saying here and there. I think that's a wonderful talent." "It's a trick," he said gently. That made 3 of her opinions he disagreed with. "Of course I like formality. I like things to be just so and on the grand scale. I know you probably don't, but you must admit it's a sign of solidity in me. But again, to go back, you can keep a party moving by just a little sentence or a saying here and there. I think that's a wonderful talent." In a sense, Fitzgerald is, I think, expressing this dismissal that all of his powers with words were perhaps never anything more than keeping a party moving by just a little sentence or a saying here or there. That he and I think to a certain extent the way he viewed Zelda perhaps was that they had been the masters of this, that they had been the life of the party because they knew the perfect sentence and the perfect moment. And he's shown us this life. And yet, even as he's shown us this life, there's an emptiness to it. There's an emptiness at its core that even he, I think, is struggling to examine and express. And as the book moves towards its close, there is this famous passage where Dick Diver is attempting to show off and show this trick he can do where he stands on a board that's trailing behind a boat. And then he puts another person on his shoulders and he stands up, holding the person up. And it's something he used to be able to do. And as I was reading it this time, I couldn't help but think that as Fitzgerald's writing this, there's this mirror image of himself trying to lift the novel up, trying to finish it, trying to get the work completed and to this level of perfection that will satisfy him, and be able to stand up and hoist it up on his shoulders and say, I did it, I wrote another novel. Read this one now. This is the one that has my real meaning, the truth in it. And as Dick Diver keeps falling off, I think perhaps Fitzgerald was wondering, am I ever going to be able to hoist this novel up? And the way he writes this passage, when the men had ridden long enough to find their balance, Dick knelt, and putting the back of his neck in the other man's crotch, found the rope through his legs and slowly began to rise. The people in the boat, watching closely, saw that he was having difficulties. He was on one knee. The trick was to straighten all the way up in the same motion with which he left his kneeling position. He rested for a moment, then his face contracted as he put his heart into the strain and lifted. The board was narrow. The man, though weighing less than 150, was awkward with his weight and grabbed clumsily at Dick's head. When, with a last wrenching effort of his back, Dick stood upright, the board slid sideways and the pair toppled into the sea. In the boat, Rosemary exclaimed, "Wonderful, they almost had it." But as they came back to the swimmers, Nicole watched for a sign of Dick's face. It was full of annoyance, as she expected, because he had done the thing with ease only 2 years ago. The second time he was more careful. He rose a little, testing the balance of his burden, settled down again on his knee, then grunting, "Alley-oop," began to rise, but before he could really straighten out, his legs suddenly buckled, and he shoved the board off away with his feet to avoid being struck as they fell off. This time, when the baby Gar came back, it was apparent to all the passengers that he was angry. "Do you mind if I try that once more?" he called, treading water. "We almost had it then." "Sure, go ahead." And so they switch out the person. Now he's got to lift an even heavier man. And there's this sense that the novel that Fitzgerald has failed with, he's now moved on to something that's a little bit heavier, a little weightier, something that means more to him. This is his reality, his experience in the Jazz Age, not the experience of anybody else, not these experiences that he's creating in Gatsby. This is his. He was heavier than the first man. As the boat gathered motion, Dick rested for a moment, belly down on the board. Then he got beneath the man and took the rope, and his muscles flexed as he tried to rise. He could not rise. Nicole saw him shift his position and strain upward again. But at the instant when the weight of his partner was full upon his shoulders, he became immovable. He tried again, lifting an inch, 2 inches. Nicole felt the sweat glands of her forehead open as she strained with him. Then he was simply holding his ground. Then he collapsed back down on his knees with a smack, and they went over, Dick's head barely missing a kick of the board. And there's something about that passage that, to me, is not just Fitzgerald writing out his own epitaph and trying to look deeply into the mirror, into his reflection perhaps in the ocean there on the beach, and recognize his failures, and that this novel, in a sense, is going to be a failure on some level. But it's also fascinating that he does this. He expresses this in an action set piece worthy of Ernest Hemingway. There's something horrifying about that. There's a terrible beauty in how Fitzgerald is writing his own epitaph here as a great novelist. And so this is a book that I certainly appreciated more this time. I found more time, perhaps from patient reading, to find the gems that Fitzgerald was crafting into this story. But the emptiness remains. There's a distance about how Fitzgerald was, I think, reconciling himself to what he was writing, to his subject matter, the autobiographical nature of it, that was hard for him. I think particularly the way that he has Dick Diver thinking about being a parent something that we don't ever really see his wife Nicole doing. And that was something that I think was on Fitzgerald's mind, and how he was a father to their daughter Scotty, and how he worked with that. There's something about the way that he expresses the violence of Dick Diver, a violence that perhaps he didn't really engage in, but that he saw others engage in. And so there's something about the book that is just a little too distant, and I think keeps it from being quite what it could have been. As I said, it very much feels like we're watching a cliff tumble into a sea. And it's sad that it was a cliff that really represented the lives of real people. Another thought on this, something else I thought about this time, is that as I was reading Tender as the Night, there's something about Dick Diver where he almost feels like an alternate reality version of Jay Gatsby. If they both have this sense of having served in the war, and what if Gatsby hadn't been a sort of war hero and found this sense of being bold, this sense of dash, but rather had just served out quietly during the war, and then gone to school and had some successes there, and casually started to be slightly upwardly mobile instead of being this bold, dashing character of the Jazz Age who finds wealth and becomes a bootlegger and finds all of these successes and the consequent failures in other areas. What if instead he had been slightly better than middle class? He had taken a few strides, but not the great leaps. What would his life have been? And I think Fitzgerald here writes this sense that even that Gatsby would have found failure, would have endured the same sad aspects of life that the Gatsby of the Great Gatsby found in the end. And there's something dark there, something very brutal and sad there. The other thing I thought about Dick Diver, and this was something I thought when I was in my 20s, was that Diver in some ways shows this combination almost of the three male characters of the Great Gatsby, Nick, Jay Gatsby, and Tom Buchanan, and they're all molded into the same man suddenly. And what is that man like? He's a man who is not from the wealthiest background like Gatsby or even Nick, but he's a man who has all of Tom Buchanan's worst aspects. He's cruel. He can be incredibly vicious and unpleasant. He's a man who can just be brutally racist, just totally dismissive. And yet he's also this man who at times can be incredibly timid, who wants to make a bold step, but then pulls back in the same way that Nick does. And seeing what the way that this character of Dick Diver, in a sense, fleshes out the three aspects of those three in The Great Gatsby, and Fitzgerald drawing on himself and others to create those voices in very singular ways. Now, I will say that I think the entire novel, Tender as the Night, can be better distilled, and all of its themes are better distilled into the single story Babylon Revisited. I do think that's a masterpiece. It is one of the stories that I've reread a few times and I find maintains its power and its effect every single time. Certainly reading this side of Paradise and then seeing the other end of the tunnel on Tender as the Night is an exercise. As I had mentioned, I think Gatsby is a superior novel, and in many ways I think the theme, the writing, the story itself perhaps interests Fitzgerald even more than Tender as the Night. Love of the Last Tycoon is a curiosity to read. There's some nice writing in it, and it's interesting to see Fitzgerald writing something that's not the Pat Hobby stories. The Pat Hobby stories are Fitzgerald's epitaph to him being someone that anyone would take seriously. The Love of the Last Tycoon is this labor that does seem to be emerging with interesting detail. It's a novel that he had never written something quite like that. A book that is somewhat contemporary to Tender as the Night. It's a little earlier, but feels like an inspiration for it on some level, is The Good Soldier by Ford Madox Ford. This is set before World War I, not between the wars. But seeing the disintegration of marriages there, and truth, and the society that they all represent. This is very much an epitaph for the fin de say world, and a very strong book. After Fitzgerald, I think one of the books that probably most closely draws on Tender as the Night is Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. And this is much more of like a middle-class novel set in the Eastern US, but it's a book that examines so many of the same ideas around personal failure, artistic failure, the failure of relationships, and a book that, again, I want to get back to and reread, because I think some of these ideas will hit me very differently in my later 30s than they did the first time I encountered them. Another thing I was reminded of this time was the way that Dick Diver's slow descent to this brutal characterization, how that recalls what Shakespeare accomplished with Mark Antony between the tragedy of Julius Caesar and then Antony and Cleopatra. And so we have Antony who has the world at his fingertips. The Roman Empire is his, well, the last vestiges of the Roman Republic, the nascent empire, are his in Julius Caesar. He's the man who has found his voice, who has all this power, his dash. And then in Antony and Cleopatra, he has lost all of that. And we have he's partnered to a woman who is rising as he is falling, and who is finding her voice as he is losing his own. And it was interesting to contrast that in the sense that Shakespeare was certainly at a height of his power still as an artist when he crafted Antony and Cleopatra, as Fitzgerald was struggling, I think, to recover his own. Couple of last thoughts. Another book that I think takes off on the tender as the night, men thinking about themselves as being still interesting to younger women, would be Otherman's Daughters by Richard Stern. Stern was a great colleague of Philip Roth's as well. And then perhaps The Great Nightmare, The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway. I think this is a book that Hemingway is trying to exercise some of his own demons in this novel. And the effect that Hemingway and Fitzgerald each achieve in their writing is curious. This, of course, is a posthumous novel. How it would have been edited and finally produced by Hemingway is I think, a valid question. But there's something in The Garden of Eden where Hemingway still seems to possess a sense of fury at his relationships and his life that Fitzgerald is sadly bemoaning and mourning. So let me know if you're a huge fan of Tender as the Night. Like I said, I think there are elements of it that work, there are elements of it that just don't quite gel. And like Dick Diver trying to stand up and hoist a friend into the air, I don't know if this one quite makes it all the way up. But let me know what you think, and I hope everyone's doing well. Thanks.